Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today I'm going to be making yet another Yashica video. In this case it's going to be about a camera which I mentioned in my earlier video about the Yashica half 17. This camera is going to be the Yashica 72E. When I did that video, I was expecting this one to arrive in the mail, and it arrived the other day, and I took it out of the box and I was quite surprised at the wonderful condition. This camera, I love the chrome finish on it. It's very bright and beautiful. There are a few small marks here on the gray paint on the back film door, but other than that, it's a very beautiful looking camera. The only flaw I can really find with it are some chips here on this side here on the paint, and the fact that someone seemed to have lost the original screw and replaced it with this big wood screw. But luckily I have some extra original screws, so when I take this camera apart to clean it, I'll go ahead and remove this screw and put the proper one in. But quite amazingly, this camera looks like it needs almost no work. The light seals aren't so bad in it. They're a little dry rotted, so I always replace those. But I was surprised at how bright and clear the viewfinder was on this camera. It's quite amazing, and also that the light meter in this camera still works properly, and what's more, it's accurate. So that's kind of a real blessing on these old cameras with the selenium light meters. So the Yashica 72E was released in 1962, and it was produced for a number of years and sold pretty much all around the world. It was a fairly popular camera, and it incorporated a lot of really interesting features. This camera I think is better in some ways than the half 17 or the Electro half, which was an even harder to find Yashica camera. I'm hoping to get one to do a video about. For one thing, unlike these other cameras, it featured fully manual operation, whereas the half 17 it was an Aperture priority camera, as was the Electro half. This camera allows you to adjust both the aperture and shutter speeds manually with the fully mechanical mechanism. So unlike the other cameras, if the light meter should stop working on this camera, you can still use it at its full capability. The half-frame format became very popular in the late 50s when Olympus introduced its Pen series of cameras, and the popularity was quite intense. They were popular because they were economical, and because of the smaller amount of materials required to manufacture a camera. And in Japan in those days, the material cost was the big determining factor in the cost of goods more than the labor cost. Japan's labor costs have never been especially high compared to other countries, but in those days, in an island country which doesn't have any resources and has to import everything, especially a country where the currency is very weak, as Japan's was in those days, the material costs were a really big deal. So being able to make a camera with less material could make a really big difference in the selling price of the camera and make it much more competitive on the market. So a camera like this could be made and sold for a much less than a full frame or full ordinary 35mm camera. That made it more marketable in places like Japan and other countries, and pretty much everywhere in those days people were more economical than they are today. Back in those days, the only thing people bought on credit were things like cars and homes and occasionally home appliances, and certainly not cameras. On top of the cameras being less expensive, the half-frame format allowed you to get twice as many exposures on a roll of film, so that also made it more economical. And also, you could get these exposures on a common format of film. Other later film, smaller formats like say 110 film or the really small Minox film, these weren't really available in the early 60s, and when they were made available, sometimes it got a little bit hard to find a place to process them. But pretty much anyone could do 35mm film by 1960, so using this format with standard film made it really easy to shoot economically, and you could get the film developed anywhere. A lot of the developers didn't like it because they thought they were kind of being cheated, giving you 72 images instead of 36 or 24, whatever roll kind of film you were using. But yeah, it was quite popular, and by the mid-60s, pretty much all the Japanese makers were producing half-frame format cameras of one type or another. Of the different ones that Yashica produced, I think this is the most useful of the cameras. I don't think it's the most beautiful looking of them. I prefer the look of the half 17 or the electro half. But when it comes to a good user camera in this format, the 72E is probably better than the other two cameras. So let's go ahead and take a look at the features, controls, and functions of the 72E, and starting at the top, a very nice clean design on the top. It's a very minimalist camera. These cameras were small, and they couldn't come with all the bells and whistles which came on a full frame 35mm SLR or rangefinder camera. The simpler design also made them less expensive, but also easier to operate. There are less things to have to learn how to use, so a much shorter learning curve on one of these cameras. The first thing we have here on the top left is the light meter readout. And this is quite simple to understand. If you've never shot a film camera before or never operated a light meter before, you can learn how to use this system on this particular camera in like 5 minutes. It's really easy. What you do is you simply turn this dial here on the back to match the film speed, the light meter to the film speed of the film you have loaded in the camera. So if I'm shooting ASA or ISO 100 speed film, I simply turn this dial until the number 100 is showing at the very bottom here. And as I point the camera at what I'm going to take a photograph of, this red needle will move up or down, and it will point at one of these either red or white lines, which you can see. And these lines, if you follow them over to the right, they show a number. This is the light value number. And to operate the camera, you just simply turn the two dials here, the shutter speed and aperture dial, until that same number shows up in the little window right on top of the shutter speed ring. And then the camera is set, and all you have to do is charge the shutter, focus the camera, and shoot. Very simple and very easy to figure out, once you get used to it. Next to that, we have a shoe for mounting a flash gun. These cameras were designed to use the old bulb flashes, but you can use a modern strobe flash on them quite easily. This doesn't have a hot shoe, of course. If you're going to use a more modern flash or any kind of flash, you're going to need to use the PC sync socket here on the front of the camera. The good thing about this camera is it uses a leaf shutter instead of a focal plane shutter, so you can use fill flash at any shutter speed on this camera. Not that it has a huge variety of speeds compared to larger ones, but it does make it easier to use flash on these kind of cameras than certain other kinds. Over on this side, we have this really cool shutter button, and I like how it fits down nice and flush, and it's kind of recessed. So if you're carrying this camera in your pocket or in a small bag or something like that, it's very difficult to accidentally depress the shutter button. It fits nice and flush here, and it's threaded to accept a standard cable release, and you can also screw in one of the old style self-timers. As this is a small camera, it doesn't feature a built-in self-timer, so you can just use one of the old Walls or Ronson, or they were made by a bunch of different makers. And you just screw them in the hole here, and you turn the dial or pull the lever on them, and then click the go lever, and then you go to where you can just leave the camera sitting on a flat surface or on a tripod, and the self-timer will actuate the shutter automatically. So a very good system, and also not having a self-timer built into the shutter, that removes the most common cause of failure in these old cameras, a broken self-timer. So these old self-timers, I usually have one in my camera bag when I'm shooting old vintage cameras, because I don't trust the built-in self-timer so much. The accessory ones are better, and also they're often easier to use. Some of them have arms which move in and out, so you can see when the camera is going to take a photograph. They're very useful. Anyway, moving to the back here, I already pointed out the dial which you use to set the film speed. Here we have the viewfinder window, and this camera has a very bright and beautiful viewfinder. It's a little bit better than the one in the original Olympus Pin series cameras. The optics are a little bit bigger, and I like the design of the frame lines better. They are brighter, and the viewfinder window is located more in line with the center of the lens, so you don't have to worry about this kind of diagonal parallax adjustment when you're trying to shoot at something which is really close. The parallax on this camera is just vertical. So if you're shooting at something closer and you're looking through the viewfinder, you just need to move it up a little bit to get it within the inner set of frame lines. There are two sets of frame lines in this camera, the outer ones and the inner ones. The inner ones are denoted by a couple of small lines on the top of the viewfinder just below the outside ones. So that would be the upper limit of your subject if you're photographing at something close up. On the bottom of the camera, we have the winding lever and shutter charging, or I guess winding and shutter charging knob, that's a better thing to call it. Here we have the film counter dial, which is located around the tripod socket, which is a pretty odd place to put it, but that was necessary in order to make the top of the camera cleaner and to be able to put this timer, or excuse me, the viewfinder window closer to the center line of the lens. So there's some kind of logic in why they put it under here. And also putting the rewind knob on the bottom of the camera gives them room to rearrange things a little bit better on the top, and also to make sure that they have room to put in the light meter, because this does take up a fair amount of space on it under the top cover on the top of the camera. The front of the camera, where the lens is, this is a leaf shutter camera, so all the important controls are located on the lens body. On the very front here, we have the focusing ring, which is a kind of odd place. You have to actually turn the front of the lens itself rather than use a focus tab or focusing ring. And we have a scale located on the top, which is arranged in feet. Or excuse me, in feet and meters. We have feet on the bottom and meters on the top. And we have a couple of detents here. First, we have one for 5 meters and we have one for 2 meters. And these are for things of, I guess, common distances. So, for example, if you're shooting at 5 meters, let's say you have a group of your friends or a baseball team or something like that. This camera has a 28mm lens, so if you set them at 5 meters away, you'll be able to get everyone standing, say, in a little formation, team formation, onto your photograph. When you move it to 2 meters, this is more closer for shooting people close up, and we have a close focus range of 0.8 meter or less than 3 feet. If you prefer using feet, that's located right here on the bottom, quite easy to see. We have this orange indicator arrow here, which you use to line up the aperture and shutter speeds. The aperture ring is located on the front. This camera features, as I said, a 28mm lens with a maximum aperture of f2.8. And then we have the shutter speed in the back, which is arranged in speeds of bulb and 1/8 of a second to 1/250th of a second, which is the same you would find on the Olympus or early Olympus pin series of cameras. And in between these, we have a window. It's actually located on the shutter speed dial. And this is where the EV number pops up. So if I'm shooting the camera here today, say I'll take a picture of these trees over here, and it's recommending, say, a EV number of 12. So what I will do is I will turn the aperture and shutter speed rings until the number 12 shows up in the window. And this gives me a fixed range of shutter and aperture combinations, which I can use at this same light value number. So where I set it to initially, just by turning the dials, it's recommending aperture of f11 and a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. And that's perfectly adequate for these trees right here. But 1/30th of a second is kind of a slow shutter speed. And I don't have a tripod, and if I'm worried about not being able to take a photograph without moving the camera at 1/30th of a second, I can move both rings together, and at EV12, I have a range of aperture and shutter combinations all the way up to f4 at 1/250th of a second. So I can shoot at a wider aperture at 1/250th of a second, and this will kind of freeze the action. So let's say I'm taking a picture of the trees, and I don't want the branches to be shown blurry, like it's a little bit of a windy day and the branches and leaves are moving, and I don't want that blur in the photograph. If I choose this combination, that will kind of freeze the action. But on the negative side, at f4, the aperture is open and the depth of field is more limited, so I have to be more careful with how I focus the camera. I have to focus it more precisely. So I don't really want to focus it. I want more depth of field than that usually, especially with a scale focus camera. So The best combination for me would say be 1/125th at f5.6, or better yet 1/60th of a second at f8. I always seem to get the best results out of most cameras that I use when I'm shooting at f8. And this is a half frame format camera. As you tighten down the aperture any more than f8, you're probably going to start to notice diffraction on your images. The smaller the format you shoot, the more potential for diffraction you have. The larger the format, the less diffraction you have. So I prefer to shoot a half frame format camera at f8 or larger aperture. This is a 28mm lens, which is, I guess, the equivalent of something like 40mm or something in full 35mm format. So it does have a fair amount of depth of field already. But if I shoot it down to, if I put it down to say f11 at say 1/60th of a second, this is a really good setting for candid shooting or whatever. I would say, I could preset this. I have enough depth of field to set this at say 3 meters, and this will, if I'm trying to get pictures of people, including from say their head to their feet, this is a good setting. Preset the aperture, shutter speed, and focus. And when I'm out shooting, pretty much all I have to do is just wind and quickly compose and shoot. The good thing about scale focus cameras is that if you get familiar with, say, the aperture, the focus, and everything, you can preset the camera where you like it, and pretty much all you have to do is just compose and shoot. And it takes much less time to take a photograph. Street photography has been quite popular for a long time, and cameras like this half frame format cameras are especially well suited to candid or street photography. First being because they are small and they're not so obvious that you're taking a picture of someone. Second, they're very quiet. This camera doesn't make very much noise. It's really hard to notice from a distance when you're taking a picture of someone. And it's just wonderful for that. And the half frame format, when you're shooting on film, it's going to show you more grain than if you're shooting at the normal 35mm format, because you have to increase the, you have to blow up the print a little bit, and that kind of decreases the resolution, or shows the lack of resolution, in film at that format. Even at half frame format, film still has a lot of resolution. But I always like to shoot my favorite film is like Kodak Tri-X, which tends to show a fair amount of grain. And when you're shooting in the half frame format, it gets grainier yet. But I kind of like that effect. And I also like shooting a little bit say underexposed, which makes things a little bit darker, and I think that makes certain images more dramatic in certain situations. So these are really good cameras for that kind of shooting. Loading the film is very easy. There's a tab here on the bottom. You simply pull it down like so, and the door pops open. You have to push down on the fork here, which pushes down the rewind knob. Drop your film canister here. Push this back up to hold your film canister in place. Pull the film across, and then you'll find the slot in the take-up spool right here. Feed the end of the film into the slot, and simply wind the camera and fire the shutter until these teeth on the take-up sprocket are engaging the holes on the top and bottom of the film. Once they are, you simply close the door. Make sure to push this tab back up. It doesn't come back up by itself. And then go ahead and reset the film counter. There are teeth all around us, so you can turn it quite easily. And this particular camera counts downward. Some cameras count upward. So this one would count, say, from 72 if I've got a 36 exposure roll of film, set to 72, and as I fire it, it keeps going down and down and down, and when it gets to 0, it's time to reload the camera. Though I usually get maybe 4 or 5 extra exposures when I'm shooting one of these cameras. You can get sometimes 2 or 3 extra exposures when you're shooting ordinary 35mm film over what the counter says. In the half frame format, of course, you're going to get more. And yeah, it's pretty simple. Anyway, I really like this camera. I was really surprised at how well made it is. I love the size and the balance. I prefer this, I think, a lot in the way it operates to the half 17. Though, as I said, I prefer the rounded design of the half 17 and electro half over this camera. I kind of wish that Yashica had used those kind of design features in the half 17 with the shutter which this camera has, but Yeah, I guess they had their reasons for making the cameras like this. Anyway, that's it for my video about the 72E. I'm waiting later this week to get a new shipment of cameras in. A lot of new and interesting stuff is coming in, some of it a lot different than what I've done videos about previously. If you'd like to see these videos, please subscribe. That way you'll know when they're available. I'm always trying to get this channel to grow, to get more people interested in vintage Japanese cameras and also into film photography in general. It always helps if you click the like button. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.